Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of our podcast, EPG Talks. I'm your host, Maria Niculicea, and today I am joined by Christian Egenhofer, Senior Fellow at the Florence School of Transnational Governance. Thank you so much, Christian, for accepting this invitation. Um, Today we're discussing about the EU's 2040 climate target, which has been recently formally adopted after a long period of intense negotiations and also delays, and the role of the international carbon credits that now the European climate law prescribes. So, just to set the scene a little bit, can you please explain the big idea behind carbon crediting and how it works in the Paris Agreement framework?
Hello. Yeah, pleasure. Thank you, Anna, for having me in this discussion. Happy to discuss the carbon credits and the broader European Union climate framework. As you know, we had for a long period intense discussion, as you hinted at, on the 2040 target. It's very politicized. So it was clear there should be a 90% reduction target by 2040. But then, of course, the fine print is the difficult part. What is all in there? And for a very long time, the EU has been extremely skeptical or very negative about credits. And then now suddenly there has been a breakthrough, I would almost say a revolution. And the EU has decided to accept up to 5% international carbon credits. That is now written into the revised climate laws. And there is a reference to these international carbon credits as high quality, subject to robust safeguards, ensuring, for example, permanence, transparent governance. There is a human rights requirements, etc., etc. And the EU considers to put complementary additional measures, safeguards, criteria to what is coming from Article 6.4 Paris Agreement, which is the article that sets out the UN framework for generating and trading international carbon credits. From the very beginning, there has been a long debate, or over weeks, months, how much we should allow. Some said nothing, others said we should have 10. And
Yeah,
then,
yeah. Actually, the first in the so and sorry for interrupting. In the first proposal by the Commission, there was a 3% carbon credit allowance, and then in the formal one, then it raised to 5%.
yeah, there was a very big controversy. Some member states really did not want to have carbon credits, if possible, at all. Others wanted to have more. So the first Commission proposal was about 3%. And then as we went, it went up to 5%. It's also uh, worth mentioning that in the beginning, there was a clause in the proposal, in the draft, that would rule out using the credits for the EU ETS, and that clause has also disappeared. There is no explicit reference to the EU ETS, but in principle, depending on how the rules work, it would be possible to use them also for the EU ETS. And what we have now is that we can use these credits for the what we call the effort sharing regulation. This is a target that member states need to fulfill. We could use them for the European Union emissions trading system, or we could also use them for the LULUCF, that is sort of the land use change part, forestry, deforestation, and so on. So in principle, it could be used for all, but nothing has been settled, and there could still be rules saying we don't want it here, we don't want it here. So everything is still up to discussion, the
It's
details.
still up to debate. Okay. So there's multitude of ways the international carbon credits can be used now.
Yeah, we are just at the beginning at the moment. And to structure the beginning, there has also been a decision to have a pilot phase from 2031 to 2035. And even that is not very clear what it would be, what it could be. Can we already,
Mm,
generate credits? Can we buy them already? Can we use them, etc., etc.? All this will also need to be settled as the discussions continue.
continues, yeah. So I was wondering, because this is not the first attempt that the EU has with, and then not the first try with the international carbon credits, as they were also dictated in the Kyoto Protocol. So I'm not very knowledgeable about this debate, but I was wondering what is it that changed between the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, and what has made the EU kind of make a U-turn and resort to carbon credits now, as it was in the past very skeptical about it?
It's worth getting back to the past experience, which indeed was not very positive for the EU. Under the Kyoto Protocol, there was a so-called CDM, and JI. CDM stands for Clean Development Mechanism, and JI for Joint Implementations, which were the two flexibility mechanisms or crediting mechanisms, if you wish, which were created under the United Nations, Kyoto Protocol. Now, what happened actually was that the CDM Executive Board, that was the body under the UN that overlooked the creation and the trading of these CDM credits, and the JI supervision committee, which overlooked the JI credits. And basically, these two committees, they rubber stamped the credits, which by that time, under the EU law, could enter the ETS, basically just, created and governed by the UN. What happened then was there was a massive amount of these credits entering the EU ETS market. In fact, between 2008 and 2020, there were 1.6 billion of these credits entering. And just compare that to the annual cap that the EU ETS at the time has, that was 2 billion. So in one year was 2 billion cap, and there was overall 1.6 billion, almost as much as one year's cap worth credits coming. What happened was that the ETS price went down because these credits were rather cheap, and that really destabilized the European emissions trading system. Also, it created a lot of credibility issues because many of these credits were really of questionable quality. So, in reality, then, in what happened was that the market for credits collapsed after the EU said we cannot accept any longer these credits. There are too many of them, and they are not good enough. So the market collapsed, and ever since there is discussions: should we have not some rules of credits, etc., etc. And then under the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, there was a new attempt to build up, to create a framework for carbon credits.
Yeah, I guess that's also why this past experience also reflects now in how the law is formulated, because this 5% quota is supposed to be used for high quality international carbon credits, right? So, but do we know whether the EU already has a definition of what high quality carbon credit means, or are they referring basically to the how they are to the rules in the Paris Agreement? Like, are the carbon credits in the Paris Agreement mature enough now for the to be used in the EU climate framework?
No, we are not yet there. The discussion, not just in the EU, has just begun. But let me just repeat again. The climate law says up to 5%. So it's not. It may be 1%. It may be 3%. It may be up to 5%. And as you say, one of the key points, how much there will be really taken up by the EU, will depend on how good they are, how good the safeguards are, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm.
There are rules set up under the United Nations under Article 6.4. There are rules there, and the EU might decide to accept them. They might decide to have additional safeguards. There is also Article 6.2, which allows for more bilateral deals. So you could imagine the EU makes a deal with India and say we are buying something of this quality, of this quantity. So all these rules are still there. And maybe it's worthwhile looking at what other countries are doing. For the time being, we have different countries developing legislation, but there is no coherent framework yet emerging. We see a lot of fragmentation, but we see two front runners, or three front runners, I should say: Switzerland, Singapore, and Norway. And it's quite interesting. They all refer to high integrity, but they take very different approaches. Switzerland, for example, says we want to have strong domestic checks. Whatever comes in, we will look at it again and say we accept yes or no. Singapore says we are happy to rely on external rules, for example, from the voluntary carbon market. There has been in around or before the Paris Agreement deal on the Article 6, there has been a voluntary carbon marking evolving, which looks at integrity, etc., etc. So Singapore says we are quite happy with this, their rules, and we might accept them. Then Norway sees it in a more strategic perspective. They would call it, if you allow me to paraphrase it, more than just carbon credits. They would like to have longer term relationship with countries, and one part of that longer term relationship would be the carbon credit. So it's a diplomacy tool for them. All of this is possible, and the EU will somehow come up with its own strategic approach to this, but we will have to see which way they want to go. But it's really very early days. We have to keep in mind there has been already 28 Article 6.2 bilateral agreements between countries, but so far not a single credit has been issued. So we are in the trial and error phase,
Mm-hmm.
looking at what's possible, how should it be done, what have we learned from the past, etc., etc.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and thank you for sharing the kind of not necessarily good practices, but like the different approaches of these pioneer countries. So, you mentioned something very interesting about Norway, that they are having the strategic perspective on carbon crediting, and they're using it as a diplomacy tool. So this could be basically one advantage of the whole carbon crediting mechanism. Because I want to draw a parallel between benefits and disadvantages of carbon crediting. One benefit would be as a diplomatic tool and kind of support for climate action, climate leadership in other countries, and especially in developing regions, as well as allowing member states to have these flexibilities with the sectors that they're struggling most. As for disadvantages, there's the things that you were mentioning before that didn't work out in the Kyoto Protocol framework. And I was wondering, how do you see the balance between advantages and disadvantages?
Yeah, I mean, I'm at that moment, I don't think it matters very much how I see the balance. Discussions are very much ongoing. Let me therefore say there is, of course, as always, not surprising also in the highly controversial issue of credits, different schools of thinking. You have alluded to them. One is we should have credits to reduce our compliance costs, low cost, high quality, credits to make it easier for us to meet the targets, make it cheaper, because we all hear that there's a controversy about the cost of complying with the EU's and national climate targets. Then there is another school of thinking which says we should engage with partner countries and through Article 6, which means through international carbon credits, and therefore create incentives for them to move to carbon markets, to move to compliance carbon markets. Once they get the infrastructure done, like the monitoring, reporting, and verification, once they know how to do the crediting, once they start trading, they might feel much more comfortable to move to a kind of a ETS type of compliance market. So that's clearly an objective by some of the member states and by the European Commission. We haven't yet really decided, how the carbon credits could actually create that incentive. This will be one of the debates. If this is a strategy, how can we structure our credits in such a way that countries really feel enticed to move to compliance market? And then the third school of thinking, I could continue. There's a fifth and a sixth, but no need to go all of them in their subtleties. But there is a third school of thinking and says, hey, look, this is a way we can re-engage with or engage with our partners, those partners that like international rules. They like those that like multilateralism, all those that are liberal democracies. Shouldn't we sort of sit together and coming, and put this into our big basket of engagement? And in the Green Industrial Deal, there is this new tool of clean trade and investment partnerships. Again, a notion that is not clear what it means. It's not clear what it would mean, but essentially the idea behind this, we are creating clean trade and investment partnerships with countries like South Africa, Indonesia, India, Canada, etc., where we look at a package consisting of critical raw materials, open trade, energy, etc., multilateralism in general. And when you then look to the partners that in Southeast Asia, but also some in Africa, then of course the EU will have to come up with something on carbon credit because it could be a financing tool, but they also will have to come up with something on coal phase out. Coal is the biggest emitter, by far the biggest emitter. So countries like Indonesia, India, the EU wants to have them less coal. So if this is the objective, then we should come up with something. Maybe crediting is one of the areas, one of the tools that could really help that one. But again, as I said before, it's early days. There's a lot of ideas floating around, and we need to think them through now. And I think it's also an objective for think tank like yours to think through some of these ideas and how they could work out in the end.
Yeah, you're giving us a lot of nice research ideas right now. More work, but seems like interesting work because judging by the flow of the discussion, there's a lot of mechanics involved in the whole process and a lot of unknown pieces of the puzzle. So there's still plenty of space for ideas, and definitely the role of a think tank is to feed in ideas. Um, More of a juicier question now. At a glance, which member states do you think they're most likely to make use of these flexibilities within the EU? I think we can try to bet here. I can't speak for other member states, but I think Romania might try to use international carbon credits to offset some of the emissions that it has in the transport sector because they've been on a raising trend for some years. But this is just a hunch of mine. Anyway, just wondering how the EU countries kind of position themselves towards this flexibility, and whether there's any early signs of them using this flexibility.
Yeah, and it's betting, huh? Um,
Yes.
and now the good thing is when you're betting, we meet again in 2035, when the pilot is over, and then in 10 years' time, nobody will listen to a podcast which is 10 years old, so nobody will recognize whatever we're being saying. But more seriously, um, there is very different, approaches to this. A country like Sweden, for example, has always said we want to engage with the rest of the world on carbon pricing. We don't want to do everything our own, irrespective of whether we have moral responsibility or not. But we want to engage with other countries in the context of carbon pricing, because ultimately the global carbon price should be converging. It doesn't make sense if in one country you have 500, in the other you have zero. So by engaging in carbon credits over the longer term, the idea has been we get more carbon pricing in whatever form into it, and then that might create to convergence. So that's one. Then there are some countries, many of them from Central and Southeast Europe. We say finally we want to get cheap credits to reduce our compliance costs, so that we don't have to torture our people on transport and heating, because people tend not to like that. So trying to find an easy way out, but watch out. Um, all this hinges on the assumption that there will be credits. Yeah, that there will be credits which are high quality,
Mhm.
high integrity, permanent, having human rights requirements, etc., etc. The question is whether they will be generated. That's the first question, whether actually the infrastructure will be there. The second is, will there be really many? And a third question is, will these countries want to sell them? Because once they sold their credits, they selling also a part of their compliance. They have national contributions, these
Mhm.
countries, national NDCs. So they have their objectives, they have their obligations, and if they're selling credits, of course, they have to make up for this somewhere else. So I would still put a big question mark whether we have these credits really at the massive scale. Now, then another question comes up. So, if you want to tell your compatriots, another question comes up. to what extent these credits actually will be cheap. Huh?
Mhm.
I could imagine that certainly within the next 10, 15, maybe even 20 years, you will find a lot of domestic, uh, abatement or emissions reduction policies, measures that might be cheaper than importing credits. Huh? Now, perhaps it's another point, the third one here. So the first is whether these credits actually are there. The second, whether they will be cheap. And the third is you will get immediately, or you will get a discussion, a political discussion, which we had around the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, and the JI joint implementation under the Kyoto Protocol, whether you don't want to spend the money for investment in your own country or whether you want to spend your money for cheap, relatively cheap reduction policies in, let's say, China, let's say India, let's say Turkey. And in the end of the day, usually citizens and parliamentarians prefer that the finance minister uses the money for domestic project, domestic investment, and the energy minister likes to cut the ribbon of domestic investments and not so much spending much money abroad. Huh? And your companies may like it. They may use these credits for financing part of their investments abroad. But this has been a very political debate in the European Parliament around the CDM and the JI. And this was also one of the reasons why it became largely unpopular. Huh? So again, a lot of good questions to be asked. And let me just repeat, the EU climate law says up to 5% credits, and we will have to see to what extent, what kind of volume we'll really be able to have.
Yeah, because I'm assuming it's 5% of the total emissions of the EU, not necessarily 5% per country.
Yeah, I mean, first we are, this is the EU. The decision or the law is still ambiguous. It's
Yeah,
not yet clear whether we did some calculations and other people did calculations, and what this up to 5% or what 5% could mean in reality is something like 240 million tons or up to 700 million tons. Again, this has to be settled somehow
okay.
by the EU, which of these numbers or where in between we want to settle. And you see already by this very wide range, some countries say we want to buy a lot of cheap credits, and the others say no, 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 we don't want to buy
Mhm.
too much. So again, this tension will continue to be there for a long time. Now, you asked also to where which countries will buy and where will the money go to. Huge differences in within the EU. Um, Member states generally say we want to keep it for our domestic, the effort sharing, and therefore, ideally, we have some EU rules under which we can buy them. But it's up to us. We use our own money, we buy it. The European Commission says, I think rightly, watch out because we might be competing with each other. Different member states might be competing with each other, and that will just push up the prices. So, wouldn't it be a better idea that the EU buys it? Again, a big question. What I would suggest, whatever this is worth, is there could be a pool. The EU buys a pool of credits, which then could be in a reverse auction or through allocated fixed allocations be used by the different member states. But again, this is one of the big issues on the mechanics. How do we buy? How do we allocate these
Yeah.
credits to different countries, or do we buy them, get them directly into the ETS? That could also be a possibility. But again, we will see a bit more once the next ETS revision will be done.
Yeah, I feel like if the EU buys a pool, then it can also direct investments where it sees strategically fit. For example, in the Western Balkans, where, as you mentioned before, the coal phase out, it's still a global issue for the climate. And Western Balkans countries are preparing for a session in the European Union. So I was wondering how can, if you agree, whether carbon credits can be used as a finance tool for the coal phase out in these countries which are also close to the EU.
There are two issues. One is, yes, Western Balkan. Let me park this for a second. The other one is really coal phase out. And as I said before, the EU will somehow have to say something about coal phase out, accelerated coal phase out in countries like Indonesia, South Africa, etc., etc., should these countries decide to go down this road. Now, there is a concept which is called transition credits, which has been promoted. Again, it's early day to say whether this will work. There is pilots, there is work ongoing on measurement and accrediting, etc., etc. It's a concept worth looking at, but again, also it needs to prove itself in practice. Now, just assuming this concept works in practice, then of course the issue of Western Balkan might come in. But it's important to be aware that if things go right, the Western Balkan may be part of the EU relatively, soon. Now, if they're part of the EU, then the Western Balkan is, of course, part of the ETS. And therefore, they are part of the EU buying and not part
Mhm.
of selling to the EU. But again, uh, this depends on what our assumptions are, how fast this enlargement will happen, whether it will be complete, whether there will be a full adoption of all the EU rules, the so-called acquis, or whether there will be just a part. So also here we have no clear picture yet, except that Albania and Montenegro, should be there should be a decision for Albania and Montenegro, at least that's the current status of discussion, to join the EU. That decision should be taken at the latest by the end of the Commission's term. Now, uh, whether this means that the countries become full members or what they call staged accession or gradual accession, again, this will be depending. And what we come up with in transition, will also define whether there are credits possible in the region or not. So again, let us wait a few more years to see how this rules out. The general idea is compelling, but of course, if there's enlargement, assuming smooth enlargement, then there is no need for these countries to generate credits because they will be falling under ETS and they have a compliance
Yeah.
uh, regime. If they be longer, in the waiting room, then of course the situation may be different, and the urgency of new investment in the region is huge. There are old coal-fired plants. They are 40, 50 years. They're collapsing, so something will have to happen. In this context, I would not rule out that the crediting, may be part of the solution, But it all, as I said, it all depends on how the political dynamics evolve. But the really interesting thing about the coal phase out is the big the big Asian countries, where there is massive amount of coal still being built because there is no alternative. And now with the current war in Iran, the gas is even less of an alternative for many of them.
Yeah, yeah, unfortunately. I think we're approaching the end of our discussion, so just as a few end of the discussion remarks, if you want to say one last idea to our listeners.
Yeah, in there's a lot of throughout these discussions we have identified a lot of steps still in need to be taken, and if you wish, you can summarize uh, them in five really important ones. First, the EU will have to decide how many credits do we really take. It's not yet clear. Is it a 240 million tons? Is it a 700 million tons? And what kind of eligibility criteria do we uh, associate with them? Just giving a numbers and not saying under what rules they can be brought in is not enough. So that, I think, is the most urgent step to be taken. And ideally, the Commission says we want to settle this within a certain period so that the market and those developing the credits know here is a market, a potential market. These are the rules, so we can do something. Then there is another, important part is, do we accept only reductions? Do we accept removals, negative emissions, or avoided emissions, which in the past was not acceptable? Avoided emissions are basically those coming from coal phase out. You
Mhm.
prematurely end coal, and therefore you have avoided emissions. And that's an area which is very difficult to credit, but should that be in or out? And this is, I think, an important decision. The third one is, to which of the three pillars in the EU climate frameworks do we bring them? Do we use them for the effort sharing of the member states? Do we use them for the LULUCF, the deforestation and land use change, or do we also allow it for the ETS, or do we build a buffer and then we decide later? Uh, Again, the fourth point I would say is important to be settled. How do we buy these credits? Is it the EU? Is it the EU under, is it the member states under EU rules? Is it the member states on their own? I guess member states would say, no, no, we don't need the EU, we do it ourselves. So you will have a cannibalization effect, etc., etc. And then in the end, the fifth point is the EU will need to decide what's the relationship with the Paris Agreement, Article 6. Do we accept their accounting provisions? How do we introduce the human rights requirements that are laid out in the EU climate law? How do we do the so-called corresponding adjustments? When there is reductions, when there's credit sold, then it needs to be counted differently. So these are issues that need to be urgently, not urgently, but need to be decided fairly quickly in order to get going. And once they are decided, we should have another conversation, because then we know a bit more about which way this is going. At the moment, we have an opening. We have a big strategic approach to this and say this is important. But we are still waiting for the details. And as we all know, the devil is in the detail.
Yeah, the devil is always in the details. Yeah, and the mechanics of everything. Thank you so much for the discussion. It's been so insightful and interesting.